Hey guys, welcome back to Commander in General, where generally we talk about Commander. Today I'm super stoked to share with you a brand new deck tech for a deck that is quickly becoming one of my favorites. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Celestial Toymaker. Now, I'm not a big Doctor Who fan, no offense to anyone who is, I just haven't watched much of it besides the few episodes my English teacher made us watch in English class. Those weeping angels, pretty freaky. Anyways, you guys know I love jank. So when my friend sent me a snap of this card with the caption, Piles Tribal, I could smell jank in the water. I've played it a few times now, and I gotta say, this is some of the most fun I've had playing Commander in a while. But enough rambling, let's get into it. The Celestial Toymaker is a legendary rogue artificer that costs Esper, he's a 2/4, and his text box reads. Whenever the Celestial Toymaker attacks, look at the top 3 cards of your library. Exile any number of them in a face-down pile and the rest in a face-up pile. Defending player chooses one of those piles, and you put that pile into your hand. Okay, sounds decent, but let's keep reading. At the beginning of each end step, each opponent loses 2 life for each spell or ability that causes one or more players to guess or to group cards or permanents into a pile this turn. Now the gears are turning. This deck is all about messing with your opponents and playing mind games. We want to make people split things into groups, keep them guessing, and tax them for little bits of life along the way. We'll finish them off with some beefy airborne sphinxes. Sphinx? Sphinxi? Whatever. Sphinxes often have those sweet abilities we're looking for anyways, so it makes sense to have them as some big-bodied finishers. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty, just a reminder, the way I do deck techs is I like to give you lots of options to spark your imagination for your own versions of these decks. I think deck building is really personal, so while I'll be showing you some cool cards that I think work well with this deck, some more than others, feel free to add your own flavor because I'll be throwing out ideas left and right like the toy maker on Christmas morning. That's what he does, right? Right? The piping hot French bread and the deliciously creamy butter of this deck is the grouping aspect. The reason for this is not only is it much more common to find grouping on cards than it is to find cards that make people guess, but cards that group usually provide us with some much needed card advantage. Fact or fiction? This is the standard for these grouping card effects. In this case, our opponent will take the top 5 cards of our library, separate them into 2 piles, and we get to pick one of those piles to keep and one to put in our graveyard. Some other effects that fall into this category are Epiphany at the Drown Yard, Fortune's Favors, and Siphon Insight. Atris, Oracle of Half-Truths, is a personal favorite of mine because it makes us do some of the speculating ourselves, which is also fun. He also makes a really fun commander on his own. Sauron's Ransom is a newer card from the Lord of the Rings set that we can play for this effect as well, and if you end up playing more of the Lord of the Rings cards, our commander actually makes a pretty decent ring bearer. Jace, Architect of Thought, has this Fact or Fiction effect on a stick for his last ability, plus we get some extra utility at the first few abilities. If you're feeling cheeky, you can also play Space Belleran and divide everyone's creatures into sectors. However, this doesn't actually count as grouping, but personally I think it's a flavor win. If we really want to waste our opponent's time, we can play Phyrexian Portal, not to be confused with Portal to Phyrexia, which is actually a much cooler card. This card makes your opponent do quite a bit of work, making them look at the top 10 cards of your library and separate them into 2 face-down piles. You get to search one of those piles for a card, put it in your hand, and then shuffle the rest back in your library. Basically, you make your opponents read a short novella and you get a singular extra card. If we want permanent advantage rather than card advantage, we can play Brilliant Ultimatum. This card gives you a peek at the top 5 cards of your library. Your opponent splits them into 2 piles and you get to play lands and cast spells from 1 pile for free. It does have a giant mana cost though, so keep that in mind that it's very possible this card just sits dead in your hand all game. Removal. I would say this deck can fit more into a pillow fort strategy than a deck that is reaching out to destroy threats on the table, but sometimes we do need to get rid of pesky threats. This means we're going to need to find some removal that still fits in our theme. Admittedly, there isn't a ton, so you can fill in those other slots with some of your favorites. But if I did miss any good ones that fit our theme, please leave me a comment down below letting me know. While you're down there, maybe leave a like if you've enjoyed this video so far, and subscribe if you want to see more fun deck techs like this one. Currently, I'm trying to hit 1K subs, so those 2 things would really help a lot. Alright, moving on. Some choices for removal I would personally go with in these colors are the all too classic Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, Deadly Rolic I really like, Fractured Identity, which I think it helps support our Pillow Fort theme, Toxic Deluge, Darksteel Mutation is a nice and sticky one along with Imprisoned in the Moon. I do however feel like we could play a little less removal in this deck if we want to commit a little more to our Pillow Fort strategy, and then we just focus on playing our own game. We could play cards like Blind Obedience, Propaganda, and cards like Norn's Annex and Revenge of Ravens are doubly as good because they can also drain your... What the f***? And cards like Norn's Annex and Revenge of Ravens are doubly as good because they can also drain our opponent's life totals. When making our opponents choose between options, it's best if they are picking between bad and worse options. And we've got a couple cool cards that do that here. Choice of Damnation asks your opponents, which do you value, your life or your permanence? Whatever number they pick, we get to decide their fate. It's a brutal card, but pretty fun. Make an example. Make your opponents split their creatures into two groups, and then we get to say,
bye-bye, 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 bye-bye now, bye, bye-bye,
to one of them. Do or Die has a similar effect to make example of, but it's an oldie from Invasion. While we're talking about Invasion, let's take a little tangent to talk about Recursion, because we have another cool Invasion card that's going to help us get cards back from our graveyard and has some grouping shenanigans. Juxtaposing our Do or Die, we have Death or Glory, which lets us get half of our creatures back from our graveyard. If we build our deck right, we should also have lots of ETB effects on our creatures that will trigger even more grouping and guessing tomfoolery when they come back. Stacking this with our commander's ability, we could have our opponents losing tons of life. And being that a lot of grouping cards make us choose one pile to put in our hand and another in our graveyard, we could have it loaded with lots of good stuff by the time we get to a spell like this. We can look to Boneyard Parlay for a mini version of this effect. You exile up to 5 creature cards from your graveyard and an opponent splits them into 2 piles. You get to put all the cards from one pile onto the battlefield and under your control. And lastly here, like our Jace Planeswalker, which had our Fact or Fiction on a stick, we also have this type of effect stapled onto a Planeswalker. A timeless classic, Liliana of the Veil, everyone. Liliana is a force to be reckoned with. Her abilities force each player to discard a card, target player to sacrifice a creature, and while those are both good ways to keep our opponents at bay and build up our Pillow Fort, on her last ability, we see that same text as before. Separate all permanents target player controls into 2 piles and make them sacrifice all permanents in the pile of their choice. It's unlikely we'll drain everyone's health using just our commander's ability alone. And while we do have the back pocket Sphinx strategy for ending the game out, we might want to build up on this taxing strategy a little bit to get those life totals low. Palantir of Orthonc can actually do some work if they don't want us having card advantage. And if they can't afford to take the damage, hey, that's another card. In a similar vein, Protection Racket lets us perform a similar check on each of our opponents every upkeep, either skyrocketing our cards in hand or really chipping away at that big 4-0. And if we wanted to take their choice out of our top card draw instead, we can play Twilight Prophet and just drain them, and we don't have to have them choose anything. Along with standalone life taxing options, we can also find abilities that either double our commander's triggers or double loss of life. We have Bloodletter of Alcladzot and Wound Reflection, which will double life lost from our abilities. We could play Sakashima to become a double of our commander or other important pieces on our board. And Roaming Throne or Strionic Resonator could also double those triggers for us. It's not as useful on our commander because he triggers only when he attacks, but lots of other cards in our deck might have ETB effects, so if that's the way you're building this deck, you can also play Teleportation Circle and Conjurer's Closet. But enough grouping and taxes. I've got enough taxes in real life. I want to play an old-fashioned riddle game and make my opponents answer my questions 3. So let's take a look at some guessing cards. Golem Scheming Guide is a piece that can actually pretty safely activate his trigger every turn. And regardless of if our opponents guess correctly or not, if our commander's out, they're still going to have to lose a little bit of life. If your play group is cool, wearing their big boy pants and they're not a bunch of big blubbering babies, then they will be cool with you playing silver bordered cards. And you are going to play Hangman, and they are going to be guessing your word. And your word will be phlegm. That's right, bet you forgot there was a G in there. I did a quick Google and that was, I guess, one of the hardest 6-letter words to guess in Hangman. Liar's Pendulum is just a straight up lying game, so put your poker face on and draw that card. Speaking of grouping and guessing, you know who is good at asking cryptic questions? Sphinxes. Sphinxi. The birds. When Master of Predicaments deals damage, he makes our opponents play a game, jigsaw style. Except rather than making them chop off their legs, they have to guess whether the mana cost of a card is greater or lesser than 4. But if you ask me, that would have made a better movie. If we're looking for more of these fact or fiction effects, we can look at Sphinx of Uthun and Sphinx of Clear Skies. However, if we want to just turn all of our Sphinxes into fact or fictions, then we can play Unesh, Cryo Sphinx Sovereign. And if we're leaning into that Sphinx strategy and we just want a few more Sphinxes to be able to proc this, then we can play some other cool ones like Metamighty Ageless to give us an extra turn, Magister Sphinx to instantly change someone's life total to 10, Arbiter of the Ideals to grab a few things off the top of our deck, and Dazzling Sphinx to cast some of your opponent's instants and sorceries. Quickly taking a look at a few Doctor Who cards that will work good in this deck. The Toymaker's Trap. Depending on their guessing skills, we could draw up to 5 cards on this little guessing game, and we could do some damage along the way. Plus, how could we not play the Toymaker's Trap? And similar to the Master of Predicaments, the 7th Doctor makes them choose whether the mana cost of the card in your hand is greater or less than the number of artifacts you control. If they are wrong, you straight up just get to cast it for free. And the alternative isn't that bad either. We just get to investigate. Now we're pretty well done with this deck, and oh what a ride it's been, but I did just want to take a moment to talk about a few cards that might seem like they would work in this deck, like Space Bellran, but actually don't proc our commander's ability. Hostile Negotiations on first read seems like a card that would work really nice here, and it isn't bad, but if you look closely, it doesn't actually make us group any cards, and it doesn't make anyone guess anything, so it's actually not going to do much for us in terms of our strategy of guessing and grouping. Fatal Lore once again feels like a card that should work, but once again we are only choosing, not guessing or grouping. Manifold Insights and Burn Rune Demon are 2 more that also fall in this category. Tevit, Seller of Secrets, is cool, he's a Sphinx, so you could play it, but the ability just makes people vote, which feels in a similar vein, but once again separate. Well, that was a whirlwind, and I know sometimes I can be a bit scattered, but I truly think you will love playing this deck. If you enjoy this style of deck tech, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Like I said, I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs, so it would really help. Please, if I missed any awesome additions to this deck or I made any mistakes anywhere with rulings, let me know in the comments below, and also let me know what you'd like to see in the future. Hopefully it won't be too long until I'm back again with another deck tech, but for now, thank you for tuning in. This has been Commander in General. I'll see you next time. Peace.